You're drinking bourbon. You're drinking bourbon. You're drinking bourbon.
Welcome a special guest to the show for the very first time in a very long time.
Why is he frozen? Is he frozen? Has he frozen for you too? Oh my goodness, there he is.
Oh, there it is. I saw the
Okay.
arm movement.
What
Wow.
happened there?
There's so much drama, so much suspense. So yeah, we'd like to welcome the stranger.
Oh, we live.
We're on.
No, we're just recording.
2Age Sojourner has been it's been emphasis on the two, you know. and
Dichotomist covenantalism as opposed to
we've missed you, bro. But you know, we even got, I don't know if you saw that comment on YouTube. Some people kind of got a little bit angry that you had just gone away and felt that you were even the best part of the show. They said that.
It's not the best way to find out you've been fired.
Yeah.
You know,
so who are you paying in your church, bro?
That's right. Exactly. All right, so we're back. It's been a few weeks. That's how we roll these days. We're trying to get through. Nick's drinking bourbon, so you know, that's taken us all by surprise. We've got more books in our library. Look behind everyone and you see books everywhere. Just books as far as the eye can see. That means it's just something good.
I'll be honest, I had to borrow someone else's books just to put this behind me.
I can see at least 2 copies of B.B. Warfield amongst us. I'm sure there's a third copy somewhere.
we should make our B.B. Warfield columns just like extend in a row like that. It should, just join our screens by B.B. Warfield. I quoted Warfield on Sunday on Canonicity. Man, it's such a great
if you're going to quote him on anything, that's probably it.
That's true.
You know, I still haven't read Inspiration. What's that book? Revelation Inspiration. What's it called? His famous one.
That one. Yeah.
Yeah, that one. I still haven't read that one. I've read a lot of other Warfields, but never read that one.
Yeah, that's the only one I think I've read properly from Warfield. It was great.
Oh, what's classic is the plan of salvation is not in the collected works, and that's my favorite one.
Ah, true.
That's on the decree. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so there we go. And we are back and we're moving through covenant theology. And we have more to say on the topic as we go through this book that I have been putting on the show notes. Have you been seeing that?
I have not. But I'm very impressed. I've given up on the show notes, mate.
It's there. Probably people don't check them, but the book is there if you can. And I could say with a fair degree of confidence that it'll be on the show notes this time as well, because I've got my little thing that I just copy and paste and it's there already from the last time. And so it's going to go in. So what we're looking at
is amazing what you get done when you finish your PhD, eh, mate?
I know. A whole world opens up. Covenant theology, biblical, theological, historical perspectives. That's the book that we are looking at. It's really just a compilation of essays, which we just find helpful to work through, because it does deal with the greater topic of at least covenant theology in a systematic way, and it helps us just to talk through it in a way that might be a little bit more beneficial than otherwise if we were for anyone that is wanting to listen in and actually kind of grow. In some way, shape, or form, or even read along with those essays and see what you think in light of what we're saying, just to keep the conversation going, and just and I suppose with everything that we do and everything that we read in kind of the niche of what we're shooting for here in the podcast anyways, is just to take that theology of Meredith Kline and on the covenantal angle, certainly some of the 2Age eschatology things, some of the 2 kingdom side as well, and just really bring it to bear on all these various matters, and as the slogan goes, we're just trying to figure out what it means to do life in the 2 ages, right? That's what it ends up looking like, and just think through theology and the implication of those 2 ages. Would you like to say something now, Nick? I'm just checking because I mean, just before we started, you told me I was too long-winded and I should just shut up more. So maybe I'll just do that now.
No, but Mike, we
Yeah.
used the first 15 minutes of your monologue to prepare
Yeah.
our thoughts. And then
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
Well,
just the
go,
part I
go.
just go skip. Ah, there we go.
I could just stop now. I could do it. I
I'll
think
tell you
you'll
what
find,
I did think.
I think what you'll find is that there was actually more to these things than you realize. You know, if I just stop, that's what I think personally.
Yeah.
I feel like you might miss me a little bit. You know,
Mike, your contributions are valuable and we love you, bro.
all right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just looking for a little validation every now and again. Okay, so now we're onto the Mosaic Covenant, and we didn't like the last one, the Abrahamic Covenant. I'm not even going to mention the guy's name again. He's dead to me. Cut him off. You know, the next guy is not faring much better, unfortunately. J. Nicholas Reed again. Like, hey, nothing against you personally, brother. If you're listening, probably not listening, but anyway, if you are, you know, it's just a thing. Yeah, we're just talking through this. We're not going to critique his essay thoroughly. We're not going to do it justice. It's not even a critique. So, if it came down to it and you needed to choose between what we say and what he says, just go with him because he's done the essay. Just take us as the peanut gallery. We're trying to be, but for what it's worth, you know, we have got a few thoughts on the essay, and it does represent one of those points of, you know, at which the grouping of essays is quite diverse. You got some people, as we've said, who are really tracking along with Klein 100% there, which we like, and then some points that they veer off. And I mean, look, there's a lot. One of the things that maybe just as a sort of way to start off, and obviously when you're dealing with a subject like the Mosaic Covenant, you have to just appreciate up front that you are not, I mean, it's been a big topic, right? And people have looked at this from every angle, and it's not like they haven't considered the various possibilities. And so you have various traditions, and you know, you do just have a little slice of the pie, one drop in the ocean. You don't want to be too arrogant with that. And you know, it's really just a matter of, okay, look, my conviction falls on this area. This is what I think is going on, and then just being peaceable and ironic with that, as long as it's not leading to other things. Like theonomy, obviously, is going overkill, and that's where it starts hampering with all sorts of things, including the gospel and so forth, mission. But there are other elements. There are other views of the Mosaic Covenant that people are going to frame it slightly differently. They're going to process it slightly differently. They're going to have different nuances. I don't want to be one of those guys that goes, oh, well, therefore, you know, if they haven't said it exactly the way I'm saying it,
they're
just
not reformed.
They're not reformed, or they're not my friends, or they're not Christian, or whatever it is. Yeah, we're just not going there. And so, yeah, you know, just as a bit of a preface, and you know, so he doesn't agree with us. We don't agree with him on those nuances. But I found as a whole, you know, the essay, I found that I could read it, I could glean a lot from it, I could make what he's saying work within my I just feel I have a better way to account for the things that he's saying ultimately, you know. And I suppose that's where it goes for me. And so, you know, we'll get into what he's saying in a second, but just as some you know, preliminary caveats.
Yeah, for sure. I think maybe just to underline what you're saying and just stress that there are different views in the Reformed world. So we're talking differences amongst Reformed people, differences amongst confessional people. We're inside the family, not debating with people outside the family, like dispensationalism, for example.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the one part that you know, just to now bring the douchey side.
Stop being nice.
Enough of that. Yeah, enough of that.
I'm fine. The whole thing is just that one part. We'll get to it in a second, but he just gets Klein blatantly wrong. You know, I don't know if you guys picked it up, but it's just not, it's not correct. You know, and that's just like, okay, that's just irritating because now he's making Klein say something he didn't say, and he's making it sound like the whole thing's sounding warped at that point, and it's not even like giving everyone a fair go at the topic. I don't know if he did that. I mean, obviously didn't do it on purpose, but you know, that's something that we have to say something about. But then the rest, yeah, as you say, leave if it's not going to misrepresent any particular view, it's all good. You know, we can work.
And maybe just to preface before we tack in, I found really helpful the Glory Cloud, episode 4 and episode 5.
Glory Cloud, who are they?
So that's Chris Carhey and Charles Lee Irons. Chuck Lee, I like to call him. So, yeah, you've heard of Chuck Norris, well, now you've heard of Chuck Lee.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. That is perfect. What happens when Chuck Lee does a push-up? The earth goes down.
Ooh.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yes.
He goes up. He goes into the upper register. But yeah. So basically, what those 2 episodes deal with is the republication report by the OPC.
Yeah.
And that's very bears on what we're discussing here. So
Absolutely.
I found those 2 episodes just very helpful in terms of if you're confused at the end of this episode in terms of what Klein actually believes and the right way to understand things.
Why don't we go ahead and take the if
episodes.
right out of that? Let's just say when you are confused at the end of this episode.
Because he does make that point a few times, doesn't he? About and I think, about the confusion over interpreting Klein. And I don't know enough about Klein's scholarship if just scholarship in general, there's always going to be confusion. There's going to be different, points of view. But I guess I had a question for you, Mike, about whether or not you thought that was valid, because he made the point at the beginning, at the end. He made it a few times throughout.
No. Yeah, it's not valid. That's one of the. I mean, look, it's true that there has been confusion, and there've been people that have, really worsened that confusion. It's been unfortunate, and papers that have been written, and committees that have been held that have really not helped at all. But yeah, I mean, look, I don't know. I just honestly, it seems it's hard not to say that it feels like every part of me wants to go, well, there's no way they could have misunderstood Klein on that point. Like he's quite clear actually when you look at him, and so. It's like they're trying to squeeze him and not have him be in trouble.
They want him on their team. They want him on their team.
They want him on their team, and it's just not really working. So, anyways, well, let's get less abstract, because I think people who are listening to this will be like, "What on earth? What the heck? So, let's open it up with something that John Owen said, which I think is rightly quoted up front here. One quickly grasp what John Owen meant when he said that this subject is wrapped up in much obscurity and attended with many difficulties. And Anthony Burgess, I do not find in any point of divinity learned men so confused and perplexed, being like Abraham's ram hung in a bush of briars and brambles by the head. And Spurgeon said something similar. I think everyone who's really wrestled with, they realize.
Well, it was my big issue with the reform thing was understanding the Mosaic Covenant and the law. I mean, I don't think I was alone in that, but it's why for a long time, seeing the kind of new covenant side has a certain appeal, because at least they're recognizing that there is a problem with the way that the Mosaic Covenant fits into the greater scheme of Reformed covenant theology and Reformed biblical theology. And so I resonate with that, because it was a big pain in the neck for a long time for me. This understanding the law, gospel, and how they fit together, understanding the Mosaic Covenant, how it fits with other covenants. And like I said, I arrived at it through basically it was Galatians that really helped me. Sitting down and working through the book of Galatians that really helped me.
And he does touch on that toward the end. So one of the things he says, he actually states as his goal here, he hopes that the chapter fairly represents the Mosaic Covenant doctrine within the Reformed tradition, and serves as a useful guide for anyone trying to understand this. And then he mentions straight afterwards that Klein, there's a large debate about him, and that's true, although, as I've just said, kind of a little bit random sometimes. But one thing that's good, because what Klein says, there's a debate as to whether he changed his view or not. Klein did change his view. There's no doubt about that as you go from By Oath Consigned to Kingdom Prologue. But what's good here is let's just play it on this turf. He says, well, let's just stick with Kingdom Prologue. Amen. Let's stick with Kingdom Prologue.
I did feel he was trying to be as representative of Klein as he could be.
And that's interesting,
big chunks of quotes, and it felt like he was trying to do justice to his
I'll show you actually he says something and then he quotes something that actually contradicts what he says. I'll show you in a second when we get
I think
there.
I might have seen
helpful.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, totally.
Maybe before we get that, let's just frame it as he's framed it, and basically what he wants to do as he begins, and this is an area where we would feel comfortable. And basically what he wants to say is, there's that the Mosaic administration is an administration of the covenant of grace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, he takes the traditional Westminster view, which says there's a covenant of works in Eden, and then there's the covenant of grace of Genesis 3:15. And that covenant of grace will go through various administrations, of which Moses is one.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can agree with that. That's a very broad brushstroke, which a lot of people
Sure.
go, amen.
Can I just say that the big problem also he states right up front for me is and I don't know what you guys think, because there is a sense in which I might agree with what he's saying, but another sense in which, right up front, I think it's page 267, where he talks and he quotes from Mark Jones, which also is a red flag for me.
Yeah.
But he talks about how basically in order to make the Mosaic Covenant sort of a part of the covenant of grace in the way that he does, he has to make the covenant of grace a bilateral covenant in order to encompass it. And I understand that there is some sort of call for involvement, from God's people in the covenant of grace. I'm not, but calling it a bilateral covenant, I think, is problematic for me. I don't know what you guys thought about that. And it seems like that's what you have to do to incorporate the classic Reformed view. You have to stretch the covenant of grace to become a bilateral covenant, to incorporate the Mosaic covenant with its conditions. Absolutely. And so that in turn is going to cast a kind of Mosaic shadow across every covenant in the covenant of grace.
And maybe even
every
before
administration.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe even before we answer that or go down that track, it might be worth on that same point to throw in right after sort of saying, hey, we're going to take Klein on Kingdom Prologue and think about what Klein says on Kingdom Prologue, where he basically moves from this dichotomous position to a threefold covenant schema. And then he goes, okay, well, I am personally just going to worry about the twofold covenant schema. I'm just going to go with this dichotomous thing, which does present some difficulties on its own. I think as Klein showed, he saw some continuity with the way in which, the law, the priority of the law, was important. You've got these two covenant of works things going on, essentially, with Christ keeping the works covenant for us. If you don't have a covenant of redemption to put that in, you have to kind of squeeze all that stuff into the covenant of grace. And then you end up with even more complexity around this issue of what exactly was that covenant? Was it, was it Christ as the covenant Lord? Was it Christ as the covenant servant? Was it, what is our place, and who are the parties of that covenant exactly? So it just becomes a very difficult thing to try and navigate that. And when you move into this, covenant of redemption, it kind of frees you up to think more clearly about what's going on with that covenant of grace. So, I see an immediate point of tension here in that he's just set up that, we're going to look at what Klein is saying via the three covenant view, and then he's going to stick to the two covenant view, and you've got some, it's not translating well at that point. And so that, together with the issue of whether something is unilateral or bilateral, we have to come back to that. Yeah.
Because maybe just to jump in there, depending on what you mean by bilateral,
exactly,
I can live with it. Depending on what you mean, whether there's dichotomist or trichotomist, I can live with it.
Right.
So it's how you define those terms.
Well, immediately, just if we're talking about it now, I mean, you've got the covenant of redemption. That's obviously going to be, something that, as it applies to us, we see it as everyone agrees this is something that God is doing. We're passive in, everyone who's in the covenant of redemption is ultimately, in heaven. And this is, so the whole, we're talking salvation through and through there. But, one of the reasons I appreciate this topic as well is way back in the day when I really did a deep dive into John Gill and his flattening of the covenant of redemption into the covenant of grace. I remember reading a dissertation by Tom Ascol, and his dissertation on Gill and how that went wrong. How all the things that you need, even with the Baptist so leaving aside the kinds of implications that one could derive for a more Presbyterian ecclesiology, just leave all that aside and just stick within Baptist categories for a second. And he shows in that dissertation, you still need a divide, just for issues of justification. You need a covenant of redemption, you need a covenant of grace. You need to be able to think about the different parties. You need if even if you're not going to put it in terms of unilateral and bilateral covenants, you still need a way to differentiate. So yeah, and I totally agree with what you're saying there, Nick. It really does come down to, like, what do you mean? It's almost like, is the covenant conditional, basically? Oh my goodness, could you ask a more nebulous question? Like, what do you mean by that exactly? Yes, maybe, no, it depends is the answer.
Part of the problem, I think, was the way you spoke about the conditions of the Mosaic Covenant.
Yes,
because
that's where it gets problematic. Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he was kind of implying that
what's going on with them is what's going on in the new covenant.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So it's, oh, look, you don't keep the conditions of the new covenant in order to merit further blessings or in order to attain further blessings. You keep the new covenant out of gratitude. You keep the Mosaic covenant out of gratitude, not to attain blessings. And that's something that I just find that a little bit sort of disingenuous, because while obviously for anyone who's in the covenant of grace, there would be gratitude involved in keeping the Mosaic covenant. Obviously, because you know and love the Lord, right? But if at the same time there is also the very clear implication that if I do not keep the covenant, I'm out of the land. And so obviously, as a member of the covenant of grace, I want to keep the covenant, and I'm grateful to God for providing this means, but I am doing it so that I can stay in the land and be prosperous as well. Like that's at the very least, that's a part of it. And I think that that's what I mean about kind of stretching the covenant of grace to include this bilateral element, because then that just reads forward into the new covenant. So suddenly living the Christian life becomes, obviously the Christian life is out of gratitude, but part of that is also making sure that we do our bit.
And even the curses and blessings, because that's the disingenuous part for me. You are just not taking into account those, like, curses, that are really the curses. Just like, just do a mic drop on the curses, we could read through those, and then you try and squeeze that into the covenant of grace. I want to see that happen.
But that's exactly it, isn't it? That's what we worry about will happen and does happen.
And just to underline what you're saying there, Andre, he starts off by talking about how the greatest change in terms of continuity and discontinuity is not between the old and the new, but rather between the covenant of works moving into the covenant of grace. So that the covenant of grace basically is this large stretch of uniformity where everything, whether it's the Mosaic or the new or the Abrahamic, it's all sort of one flavor. There's this big brand of how things all function together in this side of things. Whereas I think if I can fly the flag and ring the bell for a moment, I think being a Baptist really helps here, because we do also see a major turning point of discontinuity between the Mosaic and the New Covenant. And there's an important
even on that point,
distinction there.
Yeah, obviously I agree with you there, but it's almost like the same point in some sense, which is not what he's picking up. Like the difference, but the whole point of the republication idea is that whatever discontinuity is going on between works and grace at the fall is the thing that we're picking up on, in terms of the new covenant and the Mosaic covenant distinction. So, it's exact, and to deny that is the problem, to say, oh yeah, well, we see prior to the fall, the covenant of works, and then, wow, there's this big discontinuity to grace in the covenant of grace. And then to deny that that's happening in the Mosaic covenant, the old covenant in that sense, and the new covenant, is really to deny the whole point of the Mosaic covenant in bringing that discontinuity out, right? That's the whole deal in the Old Testament, is to go, all right, let's republish Adam's covenant, so to speak. Let's in order to show the radical discontinuity between old and new covenants, and to Jeremiah 31 and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the key points that you use to kind of undergird that as well is the whole idea that there is provision for forgiveness and for restoration, and within the Mosaic covenant, which is obviously true to an extent. But I just think he massively, one key factor in that argument that has to be incorporated is that there wasn't provision for every kind of sin. the provision was very limited, and there were lots of things for which there was no provision. And there were certain sins that could not be atoned for in the Mosaic Covenant. Most of the the death penalty was the way that was sorted out, not the like, so for example, for idolatry or for murder or something like that. It's not like you could just go to the priest and make a sacrifice and be all good. You would have to suffer the penalty. And so again, even with the provision for forgiveness in the Mosaic Covenant, there are strong signs to say that that's really serving only as a shadow, which you would acknowledge, but also is a strong sign saying that actually isn't the focus of the covenant. So those kind of shadowy elements are there pointing to Christ, but the focus isn't restoration. The focus is to reveal the extent of sin and the severity of sin and lead us to Christ.
I think I would put it a slightly different way on that point. I might be missing something. Let me just throw this out there though. It's true. Well, I would say that all everything was atoned for, under the covenant of grace, Old Testament rubric, types and shadows, so forth, is appointed forward to Christ, in the same way as it is for us. The difference there is just that in the Old Testament, the Mosaic economy, you've got this state, external, physical, visible thing going on in a similar dynamic to the way that we would have church and state, except obviously not combined into one Mosaic covenant. So let's say we commit a murder now, we would go to Christ, and I trust we all believe that you can be forgiven for murdering someone, but then we would still have to go to jail. The difference there being that it's not that it wasn't being atoned for in the old covenant. It's just that there was this civil aspect. Is that
no, but the Mosaic Covenant doesn't make provision for sins like that. Is my point.
Okay.
So like, yes, someone in the covenant of grace who commits murder isn't going to go to hell. Necessarily, obviously there's true repentance if they are genuinely part of the covenant of grace.
Yeah.
Then obviously there's atonement for them in the same way that there is for us, because Christ will save them. But the within the Mosaic covenant itself, there is no provision for sins like that. That was the point I was making. There's an inbuilt limitation to the amount of restoration that can take place within the Mosaic covenant.
Well, okay, so I suppose that's what was throwing me. I mean, with the and let's use the opportunity to clarify, because this is why I think this is so helpful, where you talk differently about the Mosaic economy and the Mosaic covenant, right. Because the Mosaic economy would include the Mosaic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant and everything, that's running through that period. And so, it's all working together. So, if we're saying, could any sin be atoned for, I don't want to overly qualify that now, but you know what I mean? Any sin being atoned for during the Mosaic economy, then the answer I would say is yes. But it's not that we're saying that's getting rooted in the underlying Abrahamic covenant that is forming that part of the Mosaic economy. But what you're saying, if I'm reading you right here, it's the Mosaic law itself that, I would even push that further. Covenant. Yeah. The Mosaic covenant, as it centers on these laws and stuff, doesn't make any provision for any, are you seeing something there in terms of any restoration?
Well, no, I think there is. I think, I'm not sure I'd be willing to go that far. I mean, obviously we know that it only made provision in a foreshadowing sense. So the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sin.
So I would see that as part of the Abrahamic covenant running through the Mosaic economy.
Maybe I can jump in here. My understanding of what Andre was saying was, let's say you commit murder. Mm-hmm. The policeman doesn't rush you off to the temple, quickly offer a sacrifice, and then rush you off to go get stoned. Mm-hmm. You go, now on the way to going to get stoned, you may ask the Lord to forgive you, and you'll get forgiven by virtue of the covenant of grace. But administratively, there's no application of sacrifice, though by faith you are getting saved if you are truly repentant. You just rushed straight from crime to punishment, without any surety, without any light of shadow, typological sacrifice of Christ being applied to the criminal. So that's how I took what you were saying, Andre.
Yes, that's, I would say, well put, Nick. That's why we pay you. That's why you get the big bucks.
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, this is obviously that where it gets all, intense as you look at it.
Yeah.
There are a few texts that, to go to in the New Testament where I think you can sort of make that distinction. But just leaving that aside for now, in terms of the Mosaic economy and Mosaic covenant, yeah, I like what you're saying there, Nick. In that you've got basically, and this is where it does get, the emphasis, so to speak, at some level. It's certainly at that national typological sort of level. There's this undeniable thunderous law about it, right? That this.
Yep.
This
less light, less assurance, less knowledge of full atonement and forgiveness.
Yeah.
The murderer would have lived under a much greater sense of, I don't know what's going to happen to me now.
Yeah.
It's the Hebrews 12 thing and the two Mount Zions.
Exactly.
The one is cast in the shadow of judgment, and the other is not. There's still the same fear and trembling over a holy God, but the whole atmosphere of the covenants is different, I think.
Yeah,
no,
absolutely.
I think it's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And
like you touched on something, Mike, there, just there, that I think is also quite important and is a part of this, is I think that he got to the temporal nature of the Mosaic Covenant too late in the discussion for me. I would have liked to, when he was defining the key points of the covenant, he described as a weak covenant and a shadowy covenant, and I would have liked to have seen the whole temporal nature of it put in there, because I think that also has a bearing on what you mean when you say things like the aim of the covenant was restoration, because it was, the covenant's aim was a temporal restoration. There was more going on because of the Abrahamic covenant that was pointing us to Christ, but the actual covenant was about the land and staying in the land and prospering in the land with a physical people in a physical land.
Yeah, I get that. I would be kind of on the one side of the extreme on this question, but what I would say, and I think it clears it up nicely, and I think everything I've looked at, it bears out on this, is, I don't really see the Mosaic covenant offering any real restoration anywhere. I mean, sure, there is God being merciful and not exacting the full weight of the law every single time they sin. That's true, and that I would put down again to the undergirding grace running through in the Abrahamic covenant. You see this constant, I would strike you down, but for this promise I made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the covenant of grace, the whole thing that Paul's pulling on when he gets to Galatians. So what I think is happening over there is it's right to think that what is all that's demanded of them is a legibility of obedience. They need to be legible.
Oh, I think I understand. Okay, so just to clarify, what I was saying is that for him to articulate his point of view truly, because he was using the language of restoration. So I wasn't saying that's my view. I was saying he's using that language, and in order for him to do that fairly and truly, I think he needs to incorporate the temporal nature of the covenant in earlier in the discussion, was the point I was making. So I think I agree with you. I think I would agree with you that the covenant itself doesn't offer that reconciliation.
Yeah, the economy does during that period.
The economy does,
yeah. But
so I'd agree with that. I'm just saying, if you're going to make the point from the other point of view, if you're going to try and argue that it is an administration of the covenant of grace in the way that he's talking about it, then I think you've got to factor in the temporal nature of the covenant earlier on. Is all I was saying.
Okay, yeah. Good. Well, on that point, just before we lose that trail, and just coming back to what he was saying here, this is what I was talking about earlier. I just quickly found the reference. Let's just, for anyone that is looking at this, page 166, according to my notes here. He's talking about Klein, and he says, so while there's a way to read Klein to make the case that he held to a substantial republication of the covenant of works, in Kingdom Prologue, Klein says that the Mosaic covenant is an administration of the covenant of grace. All right. Now just think about the language we've just been using. The Mosaic covenant is an administration of the covenant of grace. Like, did Klein say that? Well, he's got a quote for us right here. And then the first three words of the quote of what Klein is saying. The Mosaic economy, Klein says, while in administration of grace, on its fundamental level of concern with the et cetera, he's not talking about the Mosaic covenant. He's talking about the Mosaic economy. So, I mean, that is just wrong. He's just didn't pick that up.
So just
And,
can you pin down for us there, Mike? When we're talking about economy, what
Yeah.
are we talking about? When we're
just a
talking
period
about
of
covenant,
time,
what are we
dispensation. So
Yeah.
just that period in redemptive history.
It's the way things worked in that period of
It's
history.
from the time, so you've got the covenant of grace. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
It's running through the Mosaic economy. That's true. Technically, strictly speaking, it is, more properly.
Administrative elements, the accidents.
Well, even before I go there, I'd just say more properly the Abrahamic covenant. Basically, you've got this underlying level of grace, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about the covenant of grace there, which is in direct continuity with the Abrahamic covenant. The reason I'm going here as well is not just because of Klein, but because of what I think Paul is saying in Galatians. I realize we haven't got there yet, but the whole point he's making there is like basically, the whole thing is when Moses comes, it doesn't annul the previous covenant. That's the actual covenant that leads to the new covenant. This is superimposed upon that covenant so as to show you the need for that covenant. So really, Paul's keeping them, running together like train tracks throughout the Mosaic economy. But it is true that from the introduction of the Mosaic covenant, we have an economy beginning that is administratively, to pick up on what you were saying there, Nick, just administratively enhanced. There's a whole lot going on there that it does have in view the Mosaic covenant. So it's not just operating as if the Mosaic covenant didn't happen, and there are things that are part and parcel of what has been revealed during that period that extend on what was promised to Abraham. You've got even just starting all the way back from Genesis 3:15. You've got you don't just have a promise of someone who is going to suffer. You've got a sacrifice, an atonement, a priestly system, a tabernacle. All of those things are. Someone put it this way. I can't remember exactly who and exactly where, but just basically, when it comes down to it, anything related to grace and forgiveness in the new covenant is ultimately going to be part of this thing that we're seeing fleshed out in a covenant of grace, underlying the Mosaic covenant, which properly speaking is related to the law principle. So it's one way to look at it.
Well, maybe let's backtrack a little bit. We may have lost some of the newbies to covenant theology. So let's go back to the dichotomist.
Here's the question. Did we ever have the newbies, bro?
I do.
I don't think this.
Some guys in my church who are listening to this.
I would like to take, as a responsible pastor,
just a shout out to Seth. Hey, Seth.
As a responsible pastor, I would like to take the opportunity to tell you to run right now. This is not going to be helpful for you.
There are guys in my church who listen to this as well, and I think their comment is, I enjoyed listening to it. Not sure I understood any of it, but
well, look, it's our opportunity to nerd out. That's what this is. I defend our right to nerd out on this stuff because we don't get to nerd out anywhere any other time. This is where we get to do it. So I must be emphatic on that point. We are absolute ridiculous nerds.
No, for sure.
Good.
Well, I mean,
Agreed.
Since we're talking about the Mosaic covenant, I think we do need to talk about the subservient covenant aspect, and then the typological way in which the subservient covenant is administered.
Yeah.
So maybe
also just to tack on to that, the fact that in Galatians 3 it's very clearly a distinct covenant, and that was the one thing conspicuous by its absence in this essay. That Paul is very, very clear that it is distinct.
He knows that view, but he rejects it. Yeah.
But I'm saying this is the exact wording of Paul. Yeah.
Just the whole. I find this really quite amazing that people can go in this direction with Paul saying that. I mean, look, I understand you can make it sort of move in this direction, but basically saying that, when Paul quotes, was it Leviticus 18:5, he
you shall therefore keep my statutes.
He's not like connecting it to the law. He's just basically really saying that, hey, if you took it to that extreme and without faith, then obviously you're a legalist and you have to keep the whole law. I mean, my goodness. That is
so we all know that the thing to land on is it's faith and works. That's what we want to
exactly.
which for anyone watching this who is a newbie, that's not right. It's not right.
Now he would reject what you're saying, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Although I did smile to myself as he was kind of saying Paul's attacking the legalists by saying, no, of course you can't do it without faith. It's faith and works that is necessary.
Yeah.
It did not make sense. But I do think genuinely that the one thing that was missing again is you, even if you don't agree with it, you've got to account for Paul's language. He labors the point that the Mosaic Covenant is distinct, and it does not amend the covenant of grace.
The law is not of faith.
The law is not of faith. It's something else. So it is a distinct covenant that is serving the covenant of grace, but it's Anyway,
Brian Estelle, he does mention that essay that he writes is fantastic on this. Just really, I'm just seeing a little thing here. In some Estelle and others, for Estelle and others, Paul is not repurposing Leviticus 18:5 for the sake of argument against legalism. Rather, Paul is highlighting an actual antithesis between righteousness of the law and the righteousness of faith.
Yeah.
Agree.
So let me set it up in light of that book that you've just quoted from. So that's the book, The Law is Not of Faith, edited by Fesco and Estelle and others. Mm-hmm. And the whole problem that the book looks at is, how do we account for the legal aspect of the Mosaic Covenant? And what we're saying is that Klein had the best approach, basically, unless you look at it through the lens of republication, unless you look at it through the lens of a typological subservient covenant, you're going to be mixing law and gospel together and running into all sorts of areas where you're causing a conditionality to be brought into the covenant of grace, because you're trying to flatten out the way in which the Mosaic Covenant and the New Covenant are on a par with each other. Mm-hmm. So unless you're seeing that difference, unless you're seeing that contrast and not a continuum.
And the same would be true at the other end of the spectrum as well, because unless you have that nuance that does incorporate the Mosaic Covenant into things, then you're going to go the other end of the extreme and just remove any laws or any conditions, because you're just going to end up saying there's no place. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's no place for any of this.
Yeah, exactly. So it becomes a real a convincing way to just pull the Bible together really and understand all its parts.
Just coming back to the Old Testament, and the conditionality of the Mosaic Covenant, is it a case of simply, just like the Christian life, we get saved by grace and out of this great gratitude, we serve the Lord, and anytime we get disciplined, whether it's the exile or the destruction of the temple, that's like a fatherly chastening.
Exactly.
It's not really judgment. And I think it's our friend Chuck Lee and Chris Carey did stress that when the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, that is the high point of judgment that is being expressed, in the biggest typological way. Judgment Day.
It's like, dude.
It's
the ultimate destruction of the temple, which is the ultimate destruction of the earth. We know what that the temple is.
If that's fatherly chastening, we're in deep trouble. It's basically
that's not fatherly chastening. That is a typological judgment being poured out. And so if that is the climax of the curses of the Mosaic Covenant, that is not part of the covenant of grace. And we have to account for that strong element of judgment, and we can only do that by reading it typologically.
And I'm
according
okay
to a principle of works.
And I'm okay with saying, just going on exactly what you were saying there. Absolutely. Amen. And then could you say that it was part of the covenant of grace in a subservient sense?
Amen.
Amen.
Typological.
So as long as you're saying it that way, that's fine. So
and that's why it's limited to physical curses and not spiritual. So you could have someone who's a born again Christian who was part of the, when Rome came in and ransacked and they died as part of the siege, as it were. That they would participate in the physical aspects of the curse, but spiritually they would die and go to heaven.
Amen. Yeah.
Just like Moses, he didn't enter the land, but he died and go to heaven. Just like Daniel.
And that point that you just made just confused me no end until to get hold of that really does make the whole thing make sense, because I'm like, well, but what happened to those guys in exile? And did they all go to hell? Were they not Christians? And like, how did God make sure that the Babylonians only took the bad guys? And it's just it's such an important point. I think just ties everything together.
Yeah.
Totally. You know, and again, just thinking about, well, he doesn't say this, thankfully, but the implication is just constantly, you know, if you're not going to say this sort of thing and go along with what Klein articulated there, then, you know, it's true that you might be able to word it in a less theocratic way, or theonomic way, I should say, or uh, try and just, you know, rein it in somehow and just avoid the implications, but it just seeps through. And I think this is what we're always so worried about. It seeps through in a kind of legalism in Christianity, but not only that, almost like a prosperity gospel legalism thing, in that you know, the curses get spiritualized, the blessings get spiritualized, right? So, you know, in fact, it's so striking. You read through Frame's critique of two kingdom doctrine, and when he gets to Klein especially, you know, he's like, well, you know, I'm okay with, he actually says this, I'm okay with there being a republication of the Mosaic Covenant if we're also happy with the fact that that republication of the covenant of works happens in every covenant from the fall. So,
and let me tell you what he'll quote. He'll quote Ephesians 6, verse 2 and 3, where Paul takes the fifth commandment, calls children to obey their parents so that you may live long in the land.
Yeah, exactly.
And,
well,
and,
it's
and,
that. Now, let me just be quickly, let me be clear. I'm not saying that Frame's abandoned the gospel and he's basically, you know, he's going basically a hard out covenant of works all the way through. What he's saying, though, is that even the covenant of works prior to the fall was actually a kind of covenant of grace. And so it's all one. And, you know, to the degree that that gets republished all the time, no problem. And then he goes, well, and he makes statements like this. Well, okay, if you're going to tell me that they lost out on the blessings of the land, the reality is every time we turn away from God, we lose out on blessings. You know, it's like always the case. And you know, it's so difficult to, because
that's
it's
just flattening it, and you're still not accounting for the destruction of the temple. You're still not accounting for the exile.
Yeah.
You're still not accounting for
how he does
curses.
do it, for anyone interested, is via a situational, like, you know, he's tri-perspectivalism. So you get, that's the principle is that God the King tells us what to do when he tells us to do it, and so forth. And so you've got this unique, what we call eschatological intrusion. He just said, okay, that was just a situational scenario. And it's just, you know, he tries to account for it. But at the end of the day, I think that you really are just, you're losing the edges of everything, and it becomes a nebulous, someone said a tri-perspectival hash. I think it was Klein that said that, and that's true. You know, it ends up just really getting problematic. But, you know, it's what I was going to say, though, is it's difficult because sometimes, especially people hearing this for the first time, they'd be like, well, it's true. Obviously, if you turn away from God, you're going to lose blessings. I mean, like, something intuitive about that. But it's just, okay, you know, that's not enough of a statement to account for those.
Well, maybe I could rehash a little bit of my sermon on Sunday. So I'm preaching through Ephesians 6. I'm preaching on children obey your parents, and we look at Paul appealing to the fifth commandment, and we see him talking about blessings. We see him talking about living long. We see him talking about prospering in the land. And so the question is, in the new covenant, how do we read these promises if A, we're not Jews, B, we're not in the land, and C, we're in the new covenant? How does this all work? And we have to say, on the one hand, on account of, by virtue of living in God's creation, he has built into his creation, in some sense, cause and effect. That if you do bad things will happen to you. If you drink and drive, you'll probably crash. So just in terms of, you know, basic common grace realities of cause and effect, there is some sense in which you'll lose blessing. And there we can maybe go to some extent with Frame. But then we have to step back and start denying certain things. We have to deny any sense of prosperity gospel, any sense of, if you do this, you will always guarantee a blessing for yourself, because we're living in some sort of theocratic covenant or administration. And then we have to go one step further and say that in the Old Testament, living long in the land and doing well in the land were both typological promises pointing forward to new creation reality. So living long is about as far as you can get to reversing the curse on the day that you eat of this, you shall die. And things going well for you would be, as you know, the opposite direction of thorns and thistles and the effects of the curse coming upon you.
For sure.
And so we understand that Paul at that point would be eschatologizing
Sure.
the promise.
Yeah.
That he'd be pointing forward to the new creation and what the land was always intended to point forward to. And so bringing that back to what children should be taking away from the way in which Paul's applying the law is basically Paul is saying to the kids, when your parents tell you about Jesus and believing in him to get into the new creation, obey them.
Totally. Amen. Whew, I'm so thankful that's over. I was starting to feel like I was in your church and I was getting a sense of like how long your sermons are.
Dude,
Oh,
it was 46 minutes. Yeah.
I was just like,
Even
let
the
it
sermons.
You
end.
hear that? Anyone from my church is listening.
I was like, oh my goodness, wow.
How long do you preach for, bro?
I'm not the only one.
I preached on Sunday for an hour.
Gosh, shush.
I know, but I preached too long. I'm just kidding. No, yeah, absolutely,
I noticed
100%.
that.
I agree. That's a great point. Now, maybe just because we're getting on to an hour for this one, let's kind of sort of land the plane here. And one thing, maybe just to say positively, is that, you know, when he works around the whole Leviticus thing and the law and grace antithesis, and then he doesn't go in Frame's direction here in this essay, and he doesn't go in where a theonomist might go. He's one of those guys that tries to reel it in, and, you know, is about as agreeable as you could ever be with that position to someone, let's say, of our position. And so, for example, he'll say, in the context of those who want to claim descent from Abraham as evidence of a right relationship with God, Jesus distinguishes between the true descendants of Abraham and those who are not. In this context, he says, truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. Richard Hayes further connects John 8 with Paul's discussion in Galatians 3, where Paul argues that those who want to live by the law must do the law perfectly. So he's basically getting functionally to the same place that we would get. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, anyone who's going to put themselves under the law is not under grace. It's just that what we're saying here is, so it's not like we're disagreeing with that endpoint in some sense. What we're doing is saying, he can't really account for that endpoint the way that he wants to, and, you know, there's a better way to do it, and that would be our, I suppose, number one critique with this essay.
Yep,
It's good.
Nice. All right, let's lest I be accused of being long-winded, let's
I feel like there's so much more to say, but let's let people go read the chapter in the book.
read the chapter if you can afford this extremely expensive book. If you can't, you just gonna have to take our word for it, because it is expensive. It's one of those pricey guys. All right, thank you, brothers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Shalom
Thank
to
you,
all.
Andre.